Victoria stepped off the plane, her posture steady, her presence undeniable. The air outside felt different, lighter, clearer. Behind her, the echoes of what had happened still lingered, a shift that couldn't be undone. Passengers whispered, glances were exchanged, but no one could deny what they had seen. Rachel sat hunched on a bench near the gate, her uniform still pressed but her confidence shattered. The authority she once wielded so effortlessly was gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. No one came to her defense. No one looked her way. She had wielded power carelessly, and now, for the first time, she understood what it felt like to have none at all. Victoria didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself, and this time, the world had seen it. If this story struck a chord with you, drop a 1 in the comments. Let me know, have you ever witnessed something like this? What would you have done? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the more we talk about these moments, the more we make sure they don't go unseen. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. The golden glow of the cabin lights bathed the first-class section in a warm, expensive hush. Plush leather seats, soft murmurs, the occasional clink of a champagne glass. A world apart from the hurried chaos of economy. As Victoria Langston stepped onto the plane, she moved with quiet command. Her elegant black suit was tailored to perfection, its sleek fabric catching the light as she strode down the aisle. No logos, no flashy jewelry, just an undeniable presence. The kind that made people sit up straighter, as if instinctively recognizing her as someone important. She reached seat 2A, gracefully sliding her leather bag under the seat in front of her, and settled in. For the first time in hours, she exhaled. She had no idea her mere existence in that seat was about to become a problem. Rachel Hartman had worked as a flight attendant for over a decade, and in that time she had seen it all. But as she glanced toward seat 1A, a flicker of something cold and unreadable passed through her icy blue eyes. She stiffened. Her manicured nails tapped against the drink tray she was arranging, her neutral-colored polish perfectly matching her carefully composed demeanor. Her posture, rigid, calculated, shifted slightly as she smoothed a hand over her crisp uniform. Rachel was a woman who prided herself on order, on knowing who belonged where. And in her mind, something about Victoria Langston, a black woman with an air of quiet confidence, occupying the most exclusive seat on the plane, didn't add up. She moved swiftly, her heels clicking against the carpet, her smile polite, but a shade too tight. She already knew how this was going to go. She just had to put Victoria back in her place. Rachel stopped beside seat 10A, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her tone was pleasant, but with a sharp undertone that made the words feel like a slap. "Ma'am, I'll need you to rebook to economy." Victoria didn't react, not immediately. She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes meeting Rachel's with an unreadable expression. "I am a first-class passenger." Rachel's thin smile didn't falter, but her fingers tensed. "I understand, but this section is for our priority guests." A pause. A deliberate, weighted pause. Victoria stayed perfectly still. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and held it up. Rachel didn't take it. Didn't even look at it. She didn't need to. In her mind, she already knew Victoria didn't belong here. Instead, she exhaled sharply, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know how you ended up here, but I need you to move." Her voice was softer now, as if she were doing Victoria a favor. Victoria's grip on the boarding pass remained steady. The first-class cabin wasn't loud, but it was alive with the kind of tension that made people hold their breath. 2 rows back, Nathan Carter, a businessman in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and a well-tailored suit, frowned. He had seen this before. The same tone, the same forced smile, the same barely concealed prejudice. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting his reading glasses, his expression growing more displeased by the second. To the right, Jessica Reed, a younger flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably near the galley. Her hands hovered at her sides, her posture tense. She wasn't blind to what was happening. But what could she do? Meanwhile, across the aisle, Ryan Mendoza, a college student with a hoodie and a skateboard sticker on his laptop case, tilted his phone just enough to start recording. His earbuds were in, but he wasn't listening to music anymore. Something about this moment told him he should document it. And he wasn't the only one who thought so. Victoria did not move. Rachel's posture stiffened, her nails digging slightly into her palm. She wasn't used to resistance. Passengers were supposed to comply, to nod and apologize, to move along without a fight. But Victoria sat perfectly still, her breathing even, her gaze unwavering. For the first time, Rachel hesitated. She could feel the weight of the cabin watching her now. But she wasn't about to lose this battle. She straightened her shoulders, took a slow breath, and let her next words drip with authority. "Ma'am, I need you to move. Now." And that's when Victoria set her boarding pass down on the tray table, folded her hands in her lap, and simply said, "No." Rachel's forced smile faltered, the tightness around her mouth barely perceptible, but it was there. A crack in the polished exterior. She exhaled slowly, tilting her head as if considering a different approach. Her voice softened, almost conspiratorial, but the sharpness in her eyes remained. "I don't want to embarrass you, but you don't belong here." The words slipped from her lips like a well-practiced line, smooth yet laced with something undeniable. There was no apology in her tone, only certainty. It wasn't a suggestion, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision she had already made. Victoria didn't react immediately. Instead, she moved with deliberate slowness, setting her boarding pass down on the tray table with quiet precision. Her fingers tapped lightly against the thick paper, the rhythmic sound almost imperceptible beneath the hush of the cabin. Her expression remained blank, but beneath that stillness, something stirred. Something sharp, measured, unshaken. She had seen this before, different places, different faces. Always the same underlying message wrapped in politeness. She could feel Rachel waiting, anticipating resistance, expecting an outburst, a plea, an excuse. But Victoria had no intention of giving her any of those things. She merely sat, composed, exuding a patience that somehow made the moment stretch, made Rachel shift ever so slightly, as if the lack of response was more unsettling than defiant. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. She squared her shoulders, a hint of frustration creeping into her stance as she carefully chose her next words. "This section is for..." She paused just long enough for the weight of it to settle, her voice laced with something unspoken, something coded, something meant to cut without being explicit. "Our priority passengers." The hesitation was deliberate, meant to signal, to draw a line between who was meant to be here and who was not. It wasn't a statement about policy, it was a statement about power, about belonging, about assumptions. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching between them, thick with meaning. Rachel held her ground, expecting Victoria to feel it, to shrink beneath it. But Victoria didn't waver, didn't flinch, didn't shift uncomfortably in her seat the way Rachel had seen others do in moments like these. Instead, she simply tilted her head, gazed steady, unbothered, and said nothing at all. The tension in the cabin had shifted, thickening like a storm cloud waiting to break. Conversations hushed, movements became smaller. Passengers who had previously feigned disinterest now cast discreet glances toward seat 1A. 2 rows back, Nathan Carter, the businessman in the navy blazer, adjusted his reading glasses and exchanged a knowing look with the traveler beside him. He had seen this before, seen how these situations unfolded, the slow unraveling of authority when challenged, the rigid refusal to admit a mistake. Across the aisle, Ryan Mendoza, the young man in the hoodie, subtly lifted his phone higher, adjusting the angle as if scrolling absent-mindedly, but ensuring the lens captured everything. His generation had learned that moments like these had to be documented, that proof mattered more than truth, when power was at play. Near the galley, Jessica Reed shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the fabric of her uniform tightening across her shoulders as she fought the urge to speak. Her gaze flickered toward Rachel, searching for some sign that she would de-escalate, but it wasn't there. Jessica pressed her lips together, biting down softly, hands tightening at her sides. She knew what was happening. She just didn't know how to stop it. Rachel took in the silent spectators, the quiet resistance in Victoria's unshaken demeanor, and something in her snapped. She folded her arms across her chest, her voice dropping to a near whisper, an edge creeping into her tone. "You can leave on your own. Or with security." It was a threat, but more than that, it was a final grasp for control, a way to reassert dominance over a situation she was rapidly losing hold of. Her breath was even, but her pulse had quickened, a frustration bubbling beneath the surface as Victoria remained unfazed. The passengers weren't looking away anymore. They were waiting, watching. The weight of expectation settled in the space between them. Rachel's fingers curled slightly against her arms, nails pressing into the fabric of her uniform as she held her stance. "Your choice." Victoria didn't shift, didn't stiffen, didn't show even a flicker of uncertainty. She simply folded her hands in her lap, her fingers resting lightly against the smooth fabric of her suit, and said in the calmest voice imaginable, "No." It was steady, absolute, unshakable, a single syllable that held more weight than Rachel's entire presence. The air inside the cabin seemed to press inward, drawing the tension tighter, wrapping it around every passenger who sat in rigid silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the hum of the plane's engines felt dimmer beneath the gravity of the moment. Rachel, for the first time since she had approached seat 1A, hesitated. She had expected resistance, sure, but not like this. Not something so effortless, so measured, so deliberately unbothered. The balance of power, the one she had been so certain was in her favor, had begun to tilt, and she could feel it, slipping away from her grasp with every second Victoria held her ground. She wet her lips, squared her shoulders, and opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The words that had always worked before, the ones that carried the weight of authority, felt suddenly empty. Rachel's jaw tensed, her fingers flexing at her sides as the weight of watching eyes pressed in from all directions. The businessman, the kid with the phone, the flight attendant by the galley, they were waiting. She knew the moment she turned, the moment she let this go, she would have lost. But she had already lost, hadn't she? She exhaled sharply, spinning on her heel, and strode toward the galley, her pace brisk, heels clicking against the carpeted floor with too much force. Behind her, a ripple of sound moved through the cabin. Murmurs, hushed but unmistakable. People shifting, exchanging glances, processing the moment in real time. The young man in the hoodie adjusted his phone again, his lips twitching into the faintest smirk, while Nathan Carter leaned back in his seat, shaking his head slightly, as if unimpressed, but not at all surprised. Jessica lingered near the drink cart, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her fingers gripping her elbows as she cast another uneasy glance toward Victoria. She had known from the beginning that this wasn't going to end well, but now, she wasn't sure who it was going to end worse for. Behind the thin curtain of the galley, Rachel's breath came quick and sharp, her fingers tightening into fists before she forced them to relax. She needed to regain control, needed to reassert herself before the situation spiraled any further. She turned toward Lucas, a senior flight attendant who had just finished organizing the beverage cart. He barely glanced up, but she leaned in anyway, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I know what I'm doing. She shouldn't be here." Lucas froze for half a second, his hand pausing over a stack of napkins, before he turned his gaze toward her, expression unreadable. "Rachel," he said evenly, "seat assignments are confirmed before boarding. If she has a ticket—" Rachel scoffed, crossing her arms. You saw her. Come on. A woman like that in seat 2A? You really think she belongs there? Lucas's expression shifted, something like disappointment flickering across his features before he sighed. I think this is a battle you don't want to fight. Rachel clenched her jaw, refusing to acknowledge the unease curling in her chest. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about something deeper, something unspoken but understood. She turned away before Lucas could say another word, shoving past the curtain and back into the main cabin. Jessica was already there, standing a few feet from Victoria's seat, her hands clasped in front of her like she wasn't sure if she should be speaking at all. Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. This isn't right. Victoria regarded her for a moment, her expression unreadable. She had seen women like Jessica before, those caught in the middle, knowing what was right but too afraid to act. Then do something, Victoria said smoothly, not unkindly, but with a quiet insistence that made Jessica swallow hard. For a moment it seemed like she might, but then she hesitated, casting a quick, nervous glance toward the galley where Rachel had disappeared, her hands curled into small fists before she exhaled, stepping back. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she repeated, then turned and walked away. A sudden shift in the air sent a ripple through the cabin, a presence far more commanding than the forced authority Rachel had wielded just minutes ago. The curtain near the galley swayed slightly before parting, revealing Captain James Holloway as he stepped into the aisle. The moment his polished shoes met the carpet, the energy in the room changed. Conversations stopped. Passengers who had pretended not to watch now fully turned their heads. Even the hum of the engines seemed quieter beneath the weight of his presence. Tall, composed, and exuding the kind of authority that needed no announcement, Captain Holloway took in the scene with a slow, assessing gaze. His uniform was crisp, his captain's stripes pressed to perfection, but it was the quiet steel in his expression that made people sit straighter. He had been flying for over 2 decades, had dealt with turbulence, technical malfunctions, even unruly passengers. But as his gaze locked onto Rachel, a different kind of storm was brewing, and he didn't appreciate the mess she had made of his cabin. Rachel straightened immediately, plastering on a tight smile as she stepped forward to intercept him. Captain, she started, her voice suddenly light, controlled. There's been a misunderstanding with seating. I was just... Holloway's stare didn't waver, sharp as a blade. A misunderstanding? His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made even those in first class instinctively lower their gazes. Rachel's smile faltered, just barely. She had counted on handling this without intervention, but now that the captain was here, she had to tread carefully. Yes, she continued, forcing her voice to remain even. I was simply addressing a ticketing issue. The passenger in 1A, she gestured vaguely toward Victoria without looking at her, must have been assigned to the wrong section. I was trying to correct the mistake before it became an inconvenience. Holloway's expression didn't change. And did you check her ticket before making that assumption? Rachel hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The answer was clear, and it wasn't the one she needed. Rachel's lips parted, her brain scrambling for a response that wouldn't make this worse. But before she could recover, another voice cut through the tension, calm yet firm. I checked her ticket, Lucas said, stepping forward from the galley, his expression unreadable. She's in the right seat. For a moment, Rachel didn't move. She didn't breathe. The betrayal hit her like a gut punch, cold and unexpected, knocking the foundation out from under her. She turned sharply toward him, her fingers curling into her palms, her carefully built facade beginning to splinter. Lucas, she said through clenched teeth, keeping her voice low, controlled. I thought we... Lucas didn't so much as glance at her. His gaze remained locked on Captain Holloway, standing tall, neutral, but unwavering. Passenger Langston is in seat 1A, he continued, his voice smooth but unmistakably decisive. Her ticket is valid. She belongs here. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears. The cabin had grown impossibly still, every passenger now openly watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. Her control over the situation, so effortless at the start, had slipped right through her fingers. And now, with Lucas's quiet defection, she knew she had lost it completely. Captain Holloway's stare sharpened. "So, Rachel," he said, voice dangerously calm, "if the ticket was checked and correct, why exactly did you feel the need to remove this passenger?" Rachel's throat was dry. I was just following standard protocol," she stammered, scrambling for footing, for any semblance of authority to cling to. "Sometimes mistakes happen, and I wanted to ensure—" "Ensure what?" Holloway's tone turned ice cold. "That a paying first-class passenger was inconvenienced for no reason?" A murmur rippled through the cabin. The businessman in the navy blazer, Nathan, exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Across the aisle, Ryan's phone was still raised, the red light on his screen recording every second. Jessica stood frozen near the drink cart, looking between Rachel and Lucas with something close to disbelief. Rachel could feel it now, the weight of all of it pressing down on her. The illusion of control, the authority she had relied on, had crumbled in a matter of minutes. And for the first time, she felt the unmistakable sting of being the one with no power at all. The air inside the cabin was thick with anticipation, stretched so tight it felt like the slightest movement could shatter it. No one spoke, no one fidgeted. Passengers held their breath, eyes darting between the captain, Rachel, and Victoria, all knowing they were witnessing something unravel but unsure of how far it would go. The quiet hum of the engines seemed distant now, muted beneath the weight of the moment. Nathan Carter exhaled slowly, crossing his arms as he leaned back in his seat, his gaze sharp, dissecting. The younger man, Ryan Mendoza, adjusted his grip on his phone, ensuring the recording was steady, his expression unreadable. Jessica, still near the drink cart, stood stiff and unmoving, her hands gripping the edge of a tray as if grounding herself against the storm that was no longer brewing but breaking. Rachel could feel it happening, the shift, the slow, humiliating collapse of the control she had been so sure was hers. Her fingers twitched before she curled them into fists, pressing them into her sides as if that would somehow steady her. Her pulse pounded in her throat, heat creeping up her neck, tightening, suffocating. She could see Lucas still standing beside the captain, his neutral expression making her feel even smaller. He had spoken with such certainty, such finality, and now, no matter what she said, no matter how she tried to frame it, it wouldn't matter. They had already decided she was wrong. She could feel the passengers' eyes on her, their judgment heavy, their silent condemnation worse than if they had spoken aloud. She darted a glance toward Victoria, still seated, still perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't smug, wasn't gloating, wasn't even looking at Rachel as if she were worth her time. That, somehow, made it worse. Rachel swallowed, throat dry, panic creeping into the edges of her mind. She had lost. She just wasn't ready to admit it yet. Victoria moved with deliberate slowness, not rushed, not frantic, just controlled. She reached into her sleek leather bag, fingers brushing past the smooth lining until they closed around her phone. Without a word, she pulled it out and placed it face up on the tray table, its screen glowing. The camera was already open. With a single tap, she hit record. Her voice when she spoke was calm but edged with something razor-sharp. "Let's document exactly how this is being handled." The words landed like a hammer, sending a visible jolt through Rachel's already stiff posture. For a moment, the flight attendant didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, with a sharp inhale, her head snapped toward Ryan, whose phone was still raised, its tiny red recording light flickering. Another passenger a few rows back had also lifted their device, angling it toward the aisle. Rachel's stomach lurched. Her mind raced, scrambling to piece together an escape, a way to turn this around, but she could already feel the ground crumbling beneath her. The judgmental stares, the passengers shifting uncomfortably. the hushed murmurs that weren't even hushed anymore. This wasn't just a conversation between her and Victoria anymore. It was public. Her breath came faster, shorter. The realization settled in like ice in her veins. This moment, this mistake, would not be forgotten. It wasn't going to disappear into the quiet memories of a long flight, something only a handful of people witnessed. It would exist beyond this plane, beyond this night. On social media, on the internet. A permanent stain, spreading wider with every second those cameras remained on. Captain Holloway, who had remained eerily silent for the last few moments, finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and far more dangerous than if he had shouted. "Rachel," he said, and she knew before he even finished that it was over. "Step aside." Rachel's breath hitched, her mind racing for a way out. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her, the silent stares of the passengers like a slow-building tide against her authority. She had to take control back. She had to make them see Victoria as the problem, not her. Swallowing down the panic clawing at her throat, she straightened her shoulders, forcing steel back into her voice. "This passenger," she said, her tone louder now, deliberate, "has been disruptive since boarding. She's making a scene, refusing to comply with crew instructions. For the safety and comfort of all passengers, I need her removed." A ripple of disbelief passed through the cabin. Victoria didn't react. She didn't need to. The truth was already unraveling, and Rachel was the only one who didn't see it. Nathan Carter let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head before turning fully in his seat. His voice, though quiet, carried the full weight of someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing moments like this. "No," he said simply. "That's not what happened." Rachel turned to him, her eyes flashing. "Sir, this is an airline matter." "It became a public matter the second you started harassing a paying passenger," Nathan interrupted, his voice unwavering. "She hasn't said a word out of turn. She's sitting in her assigned seat, and we all saw you try to remove her anyway." Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jessica, still hovering near the drink cart, finally moved. She swallowed hard, glancing between Rachel and the captain, then took a single step backward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A silent refusal to stand by what was happening. A choice. Rachel saw it, and for the first time, her confidence cracked completely. A chime rang through the cabin, followed by the calm, practiced voice of the co-pilot over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have begun our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in the upright position. Upon arrival, we ask that all passengers remain seated for a brief moment as airport personnel will be boarding the aircraft." The words carried a weight beyond their usual routine instructions. Passengers exchanged glances, the quiet murmurs intensifying. They knew what this meant. Rachel, still standing stiffly in the aisle, went rigid. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her throat working as she swallowed hard. Secure. The realization settled in like ice spreading through her veins. She darted a glance at Captain Holloway, desperate for some indication that this wasn't what she thought it was. But his face remained unreadable, his stance unyielding. Across the aisle, Ryan Mendoza lowered his phone just slightly, a knowing look in his eyes. Nathan shifted in his seat, arms crossed over his chest, expression one of pure satisfaction. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway with a practiced ease. But inside the cabin, nothing felt smooth. Tension crackled, thick and suffocating, and all of it centered on Rachel. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. The sound of heavy boots stepping onto the plane filled the hush like a drum beat. 2 uniformed security officers entered, their presence undeniable, their eyes already set on their target. Rachel's breath came short and fast. Captain Holloway finally spoke, his voice calm, decisive. "Miss Hartman, you need to come with us." Rachel's face drained of color, her hands gripping the hem of her uniform so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Captain," she started, barely above a whisper. Then she found her voice, a frantic edge creeping into it. "This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job." No one answered. She turned to Lucas, eyes pleading. "Lucas, tell them I was just following procedure." Lucas didn't move. He didn't speak. She swung toward Jessica, desperation seeping into every word. "Jessica, you saw. Back me up here." Jessica wouldn't meet her eyes. Rachel's breath came faster, panic setting in as she realized no one was standing with her. No one was going to save her. This is a misunderstanding," she tried again, voice cracking. "I was just—" One of the officers stepped forward. "Ms. Hartman, please don't make this more difficult than it has to be." Rachel's chest rose and fell rapidly. She turned, one last desperate attempt to regain control, to somehow reverse what had already been decided. Her eyes locked on Victoria, the woman who had sat through the entire ordeal with an unshakable calm. Victoria watched her, expression unreadable, still seated in her first-class seat. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say a word, because she didn't have to. Rachel's lip trembled. Her body swayed slightly, her mind catching up to the reality that had already been written. Her feet felt heavy, her legs unsteady, as she finally took a slow step forward. And then another. As she was led down the aisle, the hush inside the cabin remained. No one moved, no one spoke, until a single clap broke the silence. It came from somewhere near the back, hesitant at first, but then another followed. Then another. The sound grew, rolling through the rows like an unspoken verdict, not loud, not mocking, just acknowledgement. Rachel kept her head high, her chin lifted, but her eyes burned. She stepped off the plane, and the moment she was gone, the tension snapped, like a cord cut loose. Jessica exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her chest. Nathan leaned back with a satisfied sigh. Ryan locked his phone and tucked it into his hoodie pocket. Victoria sat still, letting the weight of the moment settle before finally reaching for her bag. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder, took a slow sip of water, then stood. As she walked toward the exit, she glanced back once. Rachel wasn't looking at her anymore. She was staring at the ground. Victoria stepped off the plane with the same quiet grace she had carried through the entire flight, her heels clicking against the jet bridge floor in steady, deliberate strides. The air outside the aircraft was cooler, sharper, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that had filled the cabin. Around her, passengers moved with cautious energy, still processing what they had just witnessed. Some exchanged hushed whispers. Others stole glances at her, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that power was not always loud. It could be silent, patient, and unshaken. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag, exhaling softly. The moment should have felt like victory, but it didn't. It wasn't a win. It wasn't even justice. It was just proof. Proof of what she had always known, what she had experienced time and time again, in different places with different faces, but always the same story. The only difference this time was that people had seen it, and this time the ending had changed. She glanced back once, instinct rather than intent, her gaze sweeping across the terminal until it landed on Rachel. Rachel sat on a bench near the gate, her uniform still neatly pressed, but her entire frame had collapsed inward. Her elbows rested on her knees, her hands pressed against her face, fingers gripping her temples, as if trying to block out the world around her. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The weight of what had happened was pressing down on her, suffocating, irreversible. A few other flight attendants passed by, stealing cautious glances in her direction, but no one stopped. No one spoke to her. The airline staff at the gate continued their work as if she no longer existed. For years, Rachel had moved through the world with effortless authority, her power unquestioned, her word final. Now, she was just another person in a quiet, empty corner of the airport, stripped of the certainty she had always taken for granted. Victoria didn't linger. She turned away, walking toward baggage claim, letting the moment settle behind her. Some would call it karma. Others might see it as consequence. But to Victoria, it was something else entirely. A question. One that lingered in the air long after she was gone. How many times has this happened when no one was watching?